Well, thank you, John, not only for that trenchant and eloquent presentation, but for its pithiness, which gives us more time for discussion. So let's start with Paolo and then Mariana. And then.
Thanks, John. This was great. And so consolidating such different issues, and in particular, I found it very helpful as a way of thinking about the very criterion that you were asked to apply, develop how do we even begin to define what counts as family-friendly policy? Now, on that question, one of the things that you don't take up, you can't take up everything. This isn't, I don't want to present the critique of a paper because it's not the paper that someone else might have written, right? That's not what I'm trying to do. But it's interesting that if I think of family unfriendly policies, right? So a lot of times it seems to me that many of the things that have come up in discussion is legislation that shouldn't exist, that intrudes in harmful ways into the realm of policy, right? Vincenzo likes to talk about fiscal matters on this point. We can talk about others. And you don't hear, and I'm wondering in the UK context, whether one of the reasons, whether it's harder to identify that kind of family unfriendly policy and legislation, in part because there's only a weak form of judicial review in the country. This is here, I'm back to my constitutionalist, sort of predilections. Is it harder to find, identify, and set aside that kind of legislation? We're having a second point, I'll be very quick. In the United States, at least, or at least in my view, very much of the debate and of the cutting edge around family-friendly policies is taking place around debates regarding educational pluralism and school choice. And again, none of that's here, and I just wonder whether that's because the context is so different in the UK, or is there something there that that would be interesting to us?
So I'll answer that. Is okay. Brilliant. I mean, I love it because you ask questions that maybe I should have asked myself, but I'll do my best. I would point to the deluge of legislation that every government has. If you count up the number of acts of parliament that are passed, it's actually gone down, but the number of pages has gone up. And one feature of the pages that go up is what we call statutory instruments, which is you get the core act, which is rather slim, and then you have all the bits and pieces, the mechanics of it, which are that thick. And this means that you don't get the full parliamentary scrutiny of that mechanics. You just get some general principles. And therefore, I would point to the scrutiny of parliamentary legislation. Governments of every political hue get about 98.9% of the legislation through. It's all a frightening thought, but they do. It isn't that they don't have amendments to the legislation. That happens, but the amendments usually come in the process of legislating, i.e. through Parliament. So the point I'm making is this. Often the externalities, or what I would call the unintended consequences from the intended consequences, are never worked out. And everyone I've talked to, there are only 25 draftsmen in England, 25 people doing drafting, parliamentary draftsmen. That tells you the problem. And if you ask them, well, did you know this or did you think that? They will go, no. Did you realize the following? Or was it intended to take out Article 8 directly, or was that an accident? And the answer will often be, we didn't spot that, or maybe it was fudged. The point is that if the monopoly of political power, the accretion of political policy making is such, even the sort of quango institutions that advise Parliament and help make policy, they are impotent to controlling the process by which the law is made. Your point about judicial review is a very fair point, but I don't think the answer in our system would ever be to increase judicial review. In fact, it's the opposite that's happening. Judges have their part to play, but they fill in gaps magnificently, but they cannot recreate a positive outcome from a negative. That's impossible. So I would say that that is the reason. It's policy failure. I don't see any effective Christian or we call them moral issues being appropriately discussed in the way legislation has been passed. The House of Lords does its best, and that's another conversation. But it, in a sense, is fettered somewhat by the way in which the constraints of political power in the House of Commons can overturn them. But they do their best. On education, yes, I know what you're saying. I think there is a discussion about education, but it's a slightly different one than the one in the United States, partly because we have a state school system, comprehensive education. Our public school, which means private school, as you know, it, in fact, although it's often criticized by the left and misunderstood by the writers, even on the right, I was a governor in a public school. And what I did was I converted the profits into money that went to the state school. So I wasn't a very popular governor. I made it mandatory for the school to open its playing fields and its rather wonderfully spacious swimming pool to the kids next door, who, by the way, had no swimming pool. And we had to give them the clothes. You know, we had to borrow. There were borrowings. We will not go into the borrowing issue. But you see my point. I also wonder this. It's a question. Do people in Britain worry about government? They worry about politics. But they actually, are they engaged in government or governing? Do they actually get upset when, you know, something goes wrong in government? It's an interesting question. They're not obsessed with it, certainly, I don't think. I think that the politics of governing is not the same as governing. And the technical point, I've given lectures to the cabinet and so on and so forth, and I begin with the thing, governing is difficult. When you look around the table, the bright ones will say yes, and the stupid ones will say no. And then you realize you've got a problem if the majority say no. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I've tried to be as pithy as you can. And we can always talk more, but thank you for the question.
Mariana.
Okay. So thank you for the presentation, John. And your presentation made me think about things I had not thought about before. And I think this is the beauty of being in an interdisciplinary forum to discuss the issues of family. I want to go back to the issue of family mediation. I'm taking you away a little bit from policy to go more on that. About two different experiences that lead me to the question I'm going to ask you. In Argentina in 1996, when mediation started, I think it was around 1996, if I'm not wrong, the doors opened and psychologists could also be trained as family mediators. I took all the training, and then later on, the doors closed. And as far as I understand, it was really the lawyers that could make it into the legal system, of course. I think that the rationale back in the time was that it would be great for psychologists to be part of the family mediation system because of their understanding of relationships. So I don't know what happened in Argentina after that because they left the country to go to live in the United States. So in the United States, over time, I began having in these marriage and family therapy programs, lawyers that would come to be trained more into family relationships and more lately into something that has become more common, at least in the area of Virginia and Maryland, parent coordination. So now we're moving from the courtroom then to mediation and now to parent coordination, which is another attempt, another round of trying to get a better understanding of family relationships and just at the level of parenting. So as you were talking, I mean, all lights began, coming up for me, putting things together. I'm like, I think we're dealing constantly with this limitation of the legal system, trying to rule on matters that it seems that at some level they still struggle to understand. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about that?
Very good and helpful comments and question. In the UK, it's very interesting. The majority of mediators, certainly in England, I can't speak for the other parts, certainly in England, were social workers or people with that sort of background. And they came from the sort of blue-collar worker. They weren't necessarily educated to university stages. They weren't actually necessarily very articulate, but they were doing it as a voluntary business where they got some money for it. And that embryo is precious to me because in many ways, I'll give you an example very briefly. I wanted to be trained so I could, how can I recommend changes to mediation if I didn't understand what it was to be a mediator. So I went for some lessons, and the Supreme Court justice came with me because he was the same situation. We did well on the technical law. We failed completely on the outcomes because we did not understand the social security system, which is an answer. So in our system, you really have to be, it's like the Citizens Advice Bureau. You've got to actually know, I can give you a contract, I can explain it to you, but they will know what really works and what doesn't. I won't. And that's the level. Mercifully, few lawyers have got involved in this area because I think the lawyers have that different role to perform. And I think that if it's possible to have a mixture, it's all the better. There are some that are brilliant and do it very well, but the minority doesn't suggest that the majority should be legally trained. I would prefer to have a much more pluralistic group who are then giving their life experiences to the judiciary, who will listen because they will obviously want to hear outcomes that will help mediate what are often very complicated and difficult problems. So I think there's a different sociology, if you like, going on. But the points you raise are incredibly valuable, and I think they bear further discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Next, Jeffrey, and then Judah.
Thank you for an excellent paper and excellent discussion. I wanted to discuss the finance issue just a little bit, especially your appeal at the end about global finance. A huge amount of what we're talking about families surviving and about families being able to meet the needs of their children depend on this financing issue as has come up in the past. And we face two very distinct ideologies, which are the battle that continues to this day. One ideology is the church's ideology of the universal destination of goods. So the fundamental idea that there's enough to go around for everybody. The competing ideology is the Lockean idea of the right to private property. That is the fundamental Anglo-Saxon view. It is absolutely opposed to the universal destination of goods. Locke famously has a proviso which says, well, you can have private property, but you can't take as much that it prevents others from taking. But that is ignored both by Locke through a little bit of hand waving and by everyone that has ever followed Locke in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. We're facing really squarely two fundamentally different visions. And I think it's important to understand that because I'm living in an Anglo-Saxon world where the idea that a poor person should have something is something you beg for and don't achieve. It is not the ideology. The United States is a harsh and nasty place, or some place that has an average production of $65,000 per person. And it leaves people in misery. And it blames them because it's also interesting to read Locke and to read Smith and to read Malthus and to read the British thinkers on this. They created a philosophy of blaming the poor. So it's not a philosophy of mercy. It's not a philosophy of justice. It's a philosophy of blame. If you read John Locke's essay on reform of the poor laws in 1694, I think it is, he says that all children over the age of 3 should be at work because otherwise they become a burden on the community. This is really twisted. If you read Adam Smith, who's a very nice man, he happens to believe that providence will ensure that the poor are taken care of. That's the meaning of the invisible hand. We don't need a visible hand because the market system by itself will ensure. And he has paragraphs of astounding complacency. Not that he's nasty, but unbelievable complacency. The basic theory in Smith is that since rich people have to buy things, they necessarily transfer the income to poor people. And he has this both in the theory of moral sentiments and in the wealth of nations. That's the meaning of the invisible hand, that it will ensure providentially that good outcomes will come from the market system. Malthus, of course, said, don't even try, it's futile. And so Malthus cautioned against any kind of help. The British developed this into a full-fledged theory in the 19th century. If people are starving, let them starve, whether in Ireland or in India or in other places. The Americans had the added idea of slavery and extermination. And so if there are any rights, it's only for a very small subset anyway. So we're really talking about something deeply philosophical. It's why I believe the church's philosophy is central for our age, which is it's a philosophy of the universal destination of goods and universal dignity. And it is not the belief of the United States or the English-speaking world. Just know that. I'm sorry to tell you, but know it because it's hidden from view. The United States does not believe in economic rights, for example. The concept of economic rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration are never mentioned. The United States never ratified a single covenant about economic rights because we had only one president that believed in them, Franklin Roosevelt. And the whole political system after that was to deny this process. But this is philosophy. Our philosophical guru of the last 50 years is Robert Nozick. He said if someone becomes rich because they have lots of skills, fine. But he doesn't even address in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, what if someone becomes poor? Do they have any claims? It's not even mentioned in the book because the poor are invisible. Now, we have another problem, and then I'll finish. Sorry, I apologize, but I just want to make one more point. The continental countries, with a lot of history and a lot of strife, figured out that we need large public budgets to accomplish the basic needs. And so they collect 40 or 50% of GDP in taxes and spend. And the United States, much, much less. But what we've never solved, ever, in the world is international transfers. So it's not just that the United States, for example, and I'll end here, treats its own poor harshly. It's the smallest giver of development finance as a share of income of any major country because there's complete disdain for the world's poor, not even recognized. And so this is really important to understand, but there's been no breakthrough on the global side. We don't have a truly universal destination of goods. Some countries have a national destination of goods, which says within our nation we take care, but universally, it's still not on the table. That's our job, I believe, to understand what does a universal destination of goods means. It means even for people beyond our tax system. And that is not so hard because the needs are not so expensive. But you'd be amazed at how we can deny the tiniest amounts to the poor, actually blaming them for everything about their condition. And on final word, just one more piece of demystification for me. This battle of democracies and autocracies. The democracies have been the nastiest to the rest of the world. Being democratic does not mean being nice. You had the British Empire and you've had the American Empire. And they can be nice to a certain class within their societies and militarized to the hilt for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Okay, Jeffrey, that's very rich and engaging, and in fact, I agree with your analysis. What I would say is this: there's no inevitability that things will continue as they are. In fact, I think the inevitability is there's a collapse, and the collapse is coming with the economic crisis because of energy, with the poverty crisis with food, and with the housing crisis because of the absence of social housing. And if you bring them together, it is impossible for a conservative brand of private property to win elections on the basis of the rewards of making more people poor. That's my optimism. Now, I could be wrong, and we come back next year and the year after, and you can say, I've got it wrong. But I think the pendulum in the cycle of politics changes, and my hope is that when we cut our aid budget overseas, there was a backlash. You know that in England. There was a big backlash. The government was put into all sorts of problems on expenditure budgets because of it, and has in part had to retract or make a U-turn. So I agree with your analysis, but let's hope the prognosis is a little bit more optimistic. That's all I would say. Thank you for your comments.
5 minutes in our half-hour coffee break. We have Judah. Yes. What's that? Yes, coffee break is at 4. Okay. I am overruled. Coffee break now. And we'll get to I'll include you, Judah, in the general discussion.